Welcome back to the show. This is your host, Dr. Alex Earl. I am honored and excited to share with you guys the recent conversation I had with researcher and professor, Dr. and Professor Stu Phillips. Stu is a world-class researcher and professor out of the University of Waterloo up in Canada. And he has done immense work in the field of protein research, addressing a lot of the myths, a lot of the facts, fictions, addressing a lot of the concerns that people have with protein supplementation. And we dive real deep into a lot of the protein pathways, a lot of the certain populations that should be more cautious about their protein supplementation. And you get a lot of Stu's personal beliefs and biases as well. And so it was really a fun episode. I had a really good time talking about, like I said, aging, muscle, exercise, sarcopenia, protein, supplements, the works. So if you're interested in that, this is going to be for you. In other news, this episode is sponsored by Midwest Rehabilitation Institute. Coming up this month at Midwest, we have a dry needling course in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in partnership with the Wisconsin Chiropractic Association, which I believe the last I checked is either sold out at the moment or there's just one spot left. Next up in June, I'll be headed to Nashville for another dry needling for chiropractors and physical therapists. And I'm excited also to announce in July, I will be heading to Dallas to put on our first ever Essentials of Clinical Rehabilitation course in the great country of Texas. That is July 30th and 31st. If you're interested in any of the courses that we have coming up, go to mwri.co. And at the top of our website, there's a courses tab. Click on the link there, and it'll take you to all the classes we have coming up for the year. In other news, in case you haven't heard, Midwest is now taking applications for our private practice ownership coaching cohort. We consider this to be a residency of sorts for chiropractors and physical therapists in private rehabilitation-based practices. After 7 years of educational courses, we have compiled all the feedback from our events and realized there's an immediate need for the marriage of expert clinical practice with expert business operations. One of the biggest challenges private practice owners face is that they are skilled, and they know they are skilled, and we know they are skilled, but how does their community know that they even exist? So we address a lot of the issues that these rehabilitation-based private practice owners face in order for them to then fulfill or deliver on their skills. We built this mastermind. Well, let me just say, this mastermind was built by us in the trenches, so to speak, so that we aren't selling you sleazy, antiquated, or outdated marketing tactics in order to get rich quick. It's actually quite the opposite, as we are addressing the rising needs of a very changing market by leveling up the private practice industry. There's no question. We have our certain methods, and we would love to share that with you on a business side rather than a clinical side. We currently have a few spots open for our next cohort. So if it sounds like something that you'd be interested in, email us admin@mwri.co with the subject line mastermind, and we will take care of the rest in getting you all the information for the weekly call that we have lined up, as well as any additional information. We'll probably hop on a call with you to hear more about your specific clinical practice setup. Or if you're a student, this is something that we would love for you to take advantage of before you get out into clinical practice so that you can set up your practice for success on day one. That's it for the other news. Now let's dive into today's episode with Professor Stu Phillips. All right, welcome back to the show, and I'm excited to discuss all things protein with researcher and just an all-around interesting individual. And so I'm honored today to be welcomed on the show with Stu Phillips. Stu, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Alex. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I know I've said this on every episode, and I'm going to repeat it again. And they do say the repetition is a form of learning. And so I'm going to say that this is purely a selfish episode because I first heard your name through the blood flow restriction world. So your research is used in some of the BFR certification courses. And so Johnny
Yep.
Owens and Ben Weatherford, they use your protein research, in every lecture that they use worldwide. So it's really
Right on.
fascinating stuff that you've done. And so I know just a little bit about some of your research and your work within the protein world. But for our listeners and our viewers that are watching this, could you share with us a little bit of your journey and how you got to ultimately where you're at with McMaster University?
Yeah, so I studied biochemistry as an undergraduate, and I'll be honest, I was actually at McMaster University as well. And if instead of it being phys ed at the time, it was kinesiology, I'd have taken kinesiology, but it was phys ed, and I knew I wanted to do something other than to be a phys ed teacher, which was the ethos of the program at the time. So I studied biochem, but I was like, it was a varsity athlete for the entire time I was in undergraduate. Playing rugby. And it's an odd set of circumstances. I broke my leg in the last year I was supposed to, I thought I was going to go on and write the MCAT and do medical school and everything. And because I broke my leg, I couldn't play rugby. So I had a bunch of time on my hands. And so I went into a lab, and I said to the guy, his name was Rick Rashabinski, he's a molecular biologist. I said, I'm thinking of doing a senior thesis. Can I do it in your lab? He was like, absolutely. And I got in there, and I was like, honestly, like I kind of never turned back. I always thought a lot of times, you know what, maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I should go and do medicine and everything. And every time it came time to make that decision, all I knew that I enjoyed learning, and I liked school. So I know that probably sets me apart from some other people. And then, until the day you actually land your first professor job, and you're kind of sitting there. If somebody had said to me before then, you're going to be a professor, you're going to do this, I'd have been like, no way. Like, and then here I am 24 years later, after being back to McMaster. I'm a full professor and associate member of the School of Medicine, and I guess I couldn't have seen doing it any other way. So broken leg equals good outcome. At the time, I was devastated. I was really bummed, but in hindsight, it's some good things come from bad things. So.
Well, they say that that's kind of one of the things that high achievers such as yourself they view setbacks not as lifelong setbacks, but as opportunities for exploration into other avenues. So kudos to you for kind of just picking it up and run with it. So, I just couldn't help it. I looked up a couple of things, and I'm always trying to keep, a PubMed tab on the papers that you have published and stuff. And I couldn't help but notice that your H index as of just a few weeks ago, your H index was up to 122.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Because some of the people that I've looked up and I've worked with, and actually had a patient in our office in Chicagoland. And this is kind of like speaking their language, right? Where he was a researcher from the East Coast. And I just asked him, like, what's your H index? And he looked at me like, no one's ever asked me what my H index was. And it was in the low 90s. And and I was like, that's the highest I've had. So you are even a level above. And I think it's due to your diligence and your intentionality with this protein, because there's so many myths, there's so many things that are changing. And that's what I really wanted to dive in, because there's a lot of people like myself that want to learn what it is that you're learning about protein for the betterment of our patients and our clients. So I remember just my brief journey was in strength and conditioning, and I learned one set of principles in regards to protein synthesis. I remember the National Strength and Conditioning Association guidelines, 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, for our athletes. And so how has that number changed over the last few years?
Yeah, it's a good question. First, I just want to say something on the H index, and everybody goes, oh, that's so great. And I want to be very quick to deflect the limelight and just say that I may be the director or the senior person in my lab, but it's been a number of years since I've been in the lab. And so I'm made to look good by the reflected hard work of postdocs, graduate students, undergrads, et cetera, and everything. So people are impressed. And okay, that's fine, but it's not me anymore. Now, recently it has been me again, because COVID threw a wrench and everything. And I actually had to go back in the lab. And I think when I walked in and I started doing a few things, people are like, what's going on? So I'll just say that for starters. And
I
so
appreciate that. It's very, very, very,
huge.
very humble of you. So well done.
Yeah,
Cool.
well, it's true though. It's true. You want to look good, surround yourself with smart, hardworking people, and
That's right.
and I'm the beneficiary of that. But to your question about numbers, backtrack 30 years ago when I first started doing this as a trainee, it was really the RDA is all you need, the recommended dietary allowance. And, I had the fortune of working under the mentorship of Mark Tarnopolsky, still active. He's the head of the neurometabolic disease clinic here at Mac, and he was doing a project using nitrogen balance, which is, if you've ever done it, they're tough experiments to do. And he was one of the first ones that showed that bodybuilders needed a little bit more protein above the RDA, not as much as you might think. But endurance athletes needed quite a bit more. And that created a bit of a stir. And then things have sort of rolled on from there. But, one of the things I do say to people, I could actually walk away from the whole area that I've been working in if they would change the name of the recommended dietary allowance to the minimal dietary intake. Because first, I don't think you should recommend it because it's not enough. An allowance implies that that's all you're allowed, and clearly you can get more, and I think the benefits are associated with it. Now, that having been said, I'm not sure after 30 years of doing this it'll ever change. But maybe that's the nut I need to crack before I walk off and say, thanks guys, I've done all I can. This is great. MDI, we're all good.
I think it's a fair distinction, because you're right. There's people that like they just get to that threshold and stop.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of people use it as a target, as if that's where you're supposed to aim. A lot of seniors, meal programs in food for people in food insecure places use the RDA as a target, and that was never its intent. And I always say to people, I'm like, what does it mean to be a nitrogen balance? And they're like, well, you have the same nitrogen going in as going out. And I said, and what does that mean physiologically? And then there's, radio silence, because there's no outcome that we can point to that means anything. So I often say to people, we've got a crummy method, but we've got a lot of data on a crummy method, and it's sort of the method that we think is the best, but I disagree with that. And people could do with more. They could benefit from more. We recognized years ago that going above the minimum intake of vitamin C to prevent scurvy was associated with benefits. And so now it's more than, prevention of deficiency, but that hasn't happened with protein.
I think it's crucial that this type of information is constantly getting churned out. So that's why I really, really am interested in learning more from you. I know I'm not alone in saying that. One of the questions that we had, I just kind of shot a text and a short email blast out to some people just saying, hey, I'm having you on. What questions you guys have? One of them was this: is it a fact or a myth that the kidneys can only filtrate a certain amount of protein per ingestion of food? 20 to 25 grams is typically what you'll see. And so that's a common theme. Patients will come in and ask us. And so we just want to be able to ask you to then better help our patients.
Yeah. So two things to unpack there. The first is that, the thesis is that protein causes declines in renal function, et cetera. That's the Brenner hypothesis. And it really is, if you look at the kidney as a whole, it's got to filter solutes. And so if you increase the amount of solutes it has to filter, you get hyperfiltration. And then at a certain point, the kidney's just, it's doing too much and it kind of, packs it in. You get nephron dropout, death, whatever you want to call it. We've looked, my group has looked for the evidence that's actually happening using randomized controlled trials. Another review out there looked for the same evidence in observational trials, and neither could find it. So I think the point is people say, well, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. And I absolutely agree, but it's been about 60 years now since the Brenner hypothesis has been put forward, and we still don't have evidence for it. So the question becomes one of, at what point do you say, maybe the hypothesis, in humans at least, it is incorrect? Anyway, so we'll just sort of leave it there. I think when it comes to, how much protein can people manage, quote unquote, we've driven some of the hysteria in this space, but I think it's been misunderstood. You can ingest and eat and absorb a lot of protein. The question is, how much can your body use of the protein that's ingested? In our hands, it's the 25 to 30 gram number is a reasonable rule of thumb. The better approximation is it's about a 1/4 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight per meal that you can use. And that's just talking about muscle. In older people, they actually use more because they're not as efficient at getting protein into their tissues as young people are. So it's a myth to say that your body can only handle, digest, absorb, your kidney, etc. Your kidney can, deal with a lot, but it's, every species, fish excrete ammonia, birds excrete uric acid, mammals excrete urea, have got a mechanism of getting rid of excess nitrogen. So if you can't use it, you pull the nitrogen off, you're left with a carbon skeleton, and you make glucose or you burn it or whatever you do. But the bottom line is it's not capped. So people are asking the wrong question when they say we can only handle this, and I'm like, no, you can handle a lot, but you can only use this amount, which is much smaller, I think, than most people think.
Right. Well, I think that's kind of the insights that we're trying to get at here, because even if you look at protein bars or protein shakes, some of them, I mean, they used to be like 40 grams, and people are like, well, no, that's way too much. You're just gonna pee out the rest of, that you're just gonna, excrete the rest of the protein that you don't absorb. And then they just went the other way, and they just said, everything is going to be 20 to 25 because the kidneys, right? And so
which is an odd rationale, because there are groups of people around the world who eat 50, 60 grams of protein in a meal, and they're not chronic kidney disease population. To your point, it's not what I would be afraid of. It's like, more than anything, it's like, I'm probably eating more protein than my body can use, but you got to put something in the machine. I get it. So protein's not a bad choice.
Right. Well, I want to just circle back on one thing that you had mentioned earlier about kind of power lifters and endurance. Can we talk about endurance for a minute here? Because that really interests me. So endurance athletes, supplementation wise, and or just average daily intake of protein, how does that compare to like just your average person? Because they're burning so much for so long. What's some tips and advice that you have on replenishing that fuel source, so that, like, if it's right in the middle of a soccer season, how can they keep their energy stores going so they just don't hit a wall in 3 weeks?
Yeah, good question. I think the pendulum has sort of swung around on this. 20 plus years ago, you would go to a sport nutrition conference, and for endurance athletes, all you would hear about was about carbohydrates. Carbohydrate, and most people said, they get more than enough protein that they need. And I think to some extent that may be true. In other words, if you're burning so much energy and you're eating a mixed diet, then you're probably going to hit some of your protein intakes, maybe not optimally. And, I say to athletes and endurance athletes in particular, 3 R's in recovery. So rehydrate, that's easy, fluid, refuel, and that's the carbohydrate side of things, and repair. And the repair part is something they sort of talk, well, what about repair? And I'm like, well, if you're running, 120 kilometers a week, or 80 miles a week, I said, then you've got there's damage on your tissues, not just muscle, but connective tissue, bone, and everything else like that. And I point out to people, I'm like, your bone's 40% by composition protein, and they're like, I'm like, it's not just a stick of chalk, right? It's collagen protein. So, from that perspective, you need to be able to repair and remodel those proteins, if you like, but you're also burning a lot of protein during the exercise. So supplements in those situations are a very convenient way of getting to your protein targets, which I suspect are somewhere in the range of about 1.6 to 1.7 grams per kilo per day. And that having been said, if you're judicious about how you plan your food, you're probably okay. A lot of athletes aren't. They're time pressed, just like all of us. And so supplements can fill the gap, so to speak. I have been talking to some people who work in very elite level sports that the obsession now with protein is so much that it's sort of, you're stealing away some of the carbohydrate that these folks might need. And so, maybe we've unwittingly contributed to, protein's important too, but some is good, more is better, and more than more is not betterer, if you like. So you still need to balance things, I think. And, some of these athletes are engaging in sports that are very high intensity burst type sports where it's carbohydrate driven. If it's very low, prolonged intensity, carbs, not such a big deal, but don't let the protein erode your intake of some of the other nutrients. That's important. But supplements are useful, they're convenient, and I've seen athletes use them very, very effectively.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's I like what you said there. It's got to be kind of in balance and also pertaining to your goal, right? So it depends on kind of your activity and there's no one recipe that we could just give everyone to go, okay, here's the magic formula for your protein. It certainly has to be individualized. And that's kind of how we treat at our office is very individualized, right? We could have a offensive lineman from a local college playing football that's 280 290, and he's got very different movements and goals and recovery and injuries, right, compared to our triathlon or Chicago marathon runner who's 40 44, has kids and wants to qualify for Boston. Very different presentations, so therefore very different goals and obviously very different nutritional intake and recommendations. So speaking of absolutely speaking of kind of just exercise, we kind of talked a little bit about supplementation just now, but let's kind of transition over to the elderly or the aging population and protein, because this one kind of hits close to home with my grandparents as they get up into their 90s. My grandfather has passed away, but my grandma is 95, and every time I see her with one more stage progressing on the dependency side. So like the last time I saw her, we have some people helping her walk around. The next time I saw her, she's got a cane. Most recently I saw her, now she's got a walker, and I'm just like watching her muscles vanish, disappear. Now she's 95, And so I'm thinking, okay, what could I do for advice and on protein supplementation intake? Are we able to put on some muscle on a 95-year-old, or is this at this point just muscle atrophy mitigation at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's probably two parts to the story. The first part is, at least our understanding of normal sarcopenic muscle loss is that at some point in somebody's life, you're going to begin to lose muscle mass. And you're going to begin to lose some strength and power as well. The strength and power actually at a faster rate, probably because we lose motor neurons as well. That having been said, like a lot of things, the theory goes is that the more active you can be and the more high quality protein you support the activity with, that you should be able to change the slope of the curve. So the downward trajectory is less steep in somebody who's relatively active, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At 95, when your mobility is probably really declining quite rapidly, it's much harder to sort of, bend the curve. I think with some really concerted effort, you could potentially slow. I don't think you could stop it. I'm not sure that you could reverse it, that loss, but you can make, there's studies where, so-called nonagenarians, people in their 90s, are able to gain strength. What they don't gain is too much muscle, but maybe the strength and the function is much more important. It requires some pretty concerted training. And I always point out to people that it's a much better investment in your future to slow decline than it is to, in your 60s, 70s, wherever it is, have an epiphany and go, oh, I want to do something now. I mean, now we're talking about trying to bend the curve up that's already on the steepish part of the decline. And that's a much tougher proposition. So a little bit like the, osteoporosis example, or sarcopenia falls into the same thing. So early investment in building your bone mineral density pays later, as does the same with physical activity, protein intakes, and that sort of thing. That being said, I direct a center. We've got 500 plus community members that come in, average age of about 70. And I've seen some people through some really dedicated hard work. I mean, it's just empirical. And you're sort of looking at them and you're like, you're looking good. Like you're moving well and all this sort of stuff. And so it's, with hard work, it is possible. I just think it's a lot easier to put the work in ahead of time and then, change the slope of the decline, so to speak.
I think Derek Jeter said, why asked, and I think Kobe Bryant was asked something similar. And again, they're like very different in their mindset, right? They're very elite at what they did, but it was, a reporter asked Jeter why he was working so hard in the off season. And he goes, I'm 30, 35 or 36 at the time. And he was like, it's so much easier to stay in shape than it is to get in shape. So if he took the off season off and then he tries to have to start this all over again, he's like, I'm already behind the 8 ball here.
Yeah, and it's an interesting conversation to have if you get in with the elites, is that the people who recognize early that, as Jeter would say, and there's lots of other examples out there, that staying in shape and not, having the season and then getting out of shape and then trying to get back in shape probably contributes to some degree of injury resilience, I'll call it. But it definitely, my working theory is that it continues to career longevity. Those are the people, they're the LeBrons, the Serenas, you name it, the Bradys or whatever. They've just been particularly diligent at working at their craft so that they don't go through ups and downs. It's more sort of an even trajectory. And it translates, if nothing, I think, into career longevity, as opposed to some sort of other magic that they're, Tom's eating no nightshade vegetables. And I'm like, well, let's just say is that Tom has had a good offensive line in front of him. And I think he's done some good things with consistency. And so that's what the magic is. The nightshade vegetables, no, I'm not so sure on that.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. We have, if you go back to the first episode, I interviewed a physical therapist named Chris Johnson. He's from the Pacific Northwest. He actually came from the research world and then into clinical practice. And he's honestly one of my clinical mentors and heroes. Like the dude is just really sharp. But anyways, he talks about how if you want to avoid a running related injury, don't run. Or once you reach a very high level, like don't stop running, and just like keep that minor undulating performance, keep that going, and don't ever take these like big drop-offs. And so that's just that really helped treatment plan wise with patients and just programming with some of our performance clients. And so this is brilliant. This is exactly what I was hoping for. Again, purely selfish. I'm getting a ton out of this. I know a lot of people will. Continuing on just with this, because in regards to sarcopenia and as we age and we start to lose that muscle mass as we it's a chicken or the egg thing. We don't move as often as we age, so we start to lose muscle, or we lose muscle, so we don't start moving as often. You already mentioned motor neuron deficits as we start to or motor neuron changes as we age. Have you partnered with a BFR company at all to do some research into protein supplementation and BFR in regards to addressing this issue?
Yeah, no, we haven't. So I'll be honest. So my take on BFR is,
let's hear it.
There's a lot of ways to roam, and I have a good friend, Jeremy Lonicky, who is a BFR guy.
We've actually emailed back, but we're gonna have him on the show.
Yeah. He's a great guy. He and I see eye to eye on a lot of things. He rocks the boat, which I like, because it forces people, challenging dogma is always fun. You might not be right, but I think it's fun to try and poke science a little bit every now and again. Or, I mean, science doesn't change, then we're doomed, right? So BFR, my take on it is this: it's a fatiguing way to lift that promotes the recruitment of motor units that wouldn't otherwise be used. And one of the paradigms that we challenged with BFR, or with low load exercise, was that you didn't have to lift with heavier loads. In other words, I work hard to try and get my trainees to understand the difference between sufficient versus necessary. So in other words, since 1944 or 45, DeLorme publishes this paper, and its heavy loads are both sufficient and necessary to achieve hypertrophy. And, so rewind about 10 years ago, we started sort of investigating this. And the thought was that lower loads, even lifted to the point of fatigue, if you need, or close to fatigue, I don't think you need to go right to the wall. If the motor unit sort of recruitment theory is correct, you should be bringing in all motor units. There's no reason why you wouldn't. The muscle will strive to try, if you can centrally drive it, to get every single fiber involved, even if it's not supposed to be involved because it's a low load. You'll tap those high-end units. And lo and behold, 10 years hence, Brad Schoenfeld gave us a lot of help on this one as well. The paradigms change. So heavy loads are sufficient, but they are not necessary to create muscle growth. Now, rewind that and say then lower loads are both sufficient, but also not necessary to create muscle growth. The concept is true of BFR. And, the first paradigm we tested was just knee extension. So, give it a leg raise, if you like. And we used 30% of 1 RM, which is a pretty low load, light load. And everybody said, what made you choose 30? And I said, well, actually, it's not like it was a nice number we just sort of came up with. But my wife is a cardiovascular physiologist who uses non-invasive Doppler to look at blood flow. And she'll tell you that after about 20 repetitions at 30% of knee extension, and they are exquisitely painful when you get there. Everybody, you can feel that vastus medialis is just quivering away. You get complete occlusion of blood flow. There's no flow in.
Just naturally from muscle contraction.
Yeah,
That's
like
right.
the pump that you get has that effect. And so most people then can squeeze out about another 4 or 5 repetitions. Some people with training a little bit more, but it's insanely, uncomfortable. And that's the metabolic buildup and everything. Your type 3-4 afferents are going crazy. And that's why we choose 30%. We didn't choose it. We could have chosen 20%, but then you need sort of like 50 plus repetitions, and there's still flow inwards and outwards. But we chose the lightest load that we knew would result in flow occlusion after a reasonable number of reps. And that's what happens. And so it wasn't arbitrary. But then people also have ascribed 30% to other muscles and tested our theory as if it's ours. It's not ours. And it's not quite the same. And I'm like, yeah, but if you do an open, like if you're doing a curl, you're occluded here, and then you're not flow occluded here.
Right.
But what BFR does is BFR forces the occlusion earlier. And so to me, they're just, two sides of the same coin, basically, or two sides on the same coin.
Right.
It's just different ways of getting there. So that's a long answer in short to say, no, we've never used flow occlusion, but we've used lower load to fatigue on occasion to promote some pretty impressive adaptations.
And I think I should give, and I'm obviously biased and I'm partial towards, Johnny Owens and his group, because I think that they're really the gold standard in regards to the education model and just implementing it into the civilian sector, right? As they came out of the Department of Defense. But I do want to give them a lot of credit too, because they do talk a lot about how that number comes up, but they also talk about how, like, if you can lift heavy, go lift heavy. You don't need to do,
Sure.
low, flow occlusion or restriction, like go lift
Yeah.
heavy, And so
Yeah.
that's why I like them, because they're very transparent and direct. And so they know when it's useful and when it's not. And so I learned a lot. I learned a
Yeah.
lot from them. And that's actually where I think I mentioned this earlier, but that's where I first had to like go back into cellular physiology and look at what the heck is mTOR C1. And I'm looking at all these, what is all this stuff? And that really, really opened my eyes into this whole, I'm going to call it a game, this whole game of protein synthesis, and you have net protein balance. I'm like, holy cow, this is taking me back to undergrad and then also graduate school with cellular, all of that fun stuff. But then when the outcome is based on a patient, how I can learn this information to help a patient versus I can learn this information to pass a test, I'm way more focused, way more engaged. And so I found the protein synthesis conversation way more entertaining, and I was way more engaged in the postgraduate world than I was when I was in undergrad, if that makes any sense.
No, I get it. I mean, it's one of these things where, all of a sudden something pushes an intellectual button that if you're driven that way, it just hardwires you to go like, and the question you always ask, because you asked it when you were 2, is why?
That's right.
Why? And some people are content with because, whereas others are like, no, that's not good enough. I need to learn more. I need to get into this more. But BFR and low load, like, I mean, I think the point is, to your point, nobody ever said do BFR forever and all the time.
Right.
Don't do anything else. And that's what we say with low load. But the contortions that the establishment, a vague term of heavy or nothing, have gone through to sort of dismiss or dispel or, somehow, smudge, low load, who lives low loads.
That's right.
It's been incredible to watch. And, I have, let's just say is that there are a few individuals who, like, they get really, really twisted about this. And I don't know why. I think because they were so into the philosophy of it, heavy or nothing, that it's just such a challenge to their psyche or their manhood or their ethos or whatever it is, that they won't probably ever change, to be honest with you, which is sad, but that's the way it goes.
Yeah. I immediately have some thoughts on that, because even when presented with evidence, and that might be a strong word, but even when presented with evidence contrary to one's views, you kind of have a choice. You could double down, or you could be open-minded and say, okay, well, I might have been wrong, and I need to learn. I might not have all the answers, and that takes a little humility,
It's humbling. And I wouldn't, after 24 years, I'd love to be able to stand up here or, be on your podcast and say, we've never been wrong,
Yeah.
But that's not true.
So I would not have invited you if that's kind of the tone that you present yourself. And I'm not saying that about the status of our show. I'm saying that that's not the type of person that this show is drawn to. If there are other platforms where people would love to hear people say that I'm God's gift, I know it all, just not this show. So I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Go on.
Yeah, no. I've been forced to walk back several things that early on in my career I was pretty dogmatic about, because that was the evidence at the time, and I was younger, I think. And that just, it's only with the gift of hindsight that you sort of, and people have said, when I've, protein requirements and all sorts of things, I'm like, I used to be this. And I'm like, no, I think actually this is, and they said, but you said before. And I'm like, no, the active word there is before.
Right.
I said, so now my opinion's changed. And, what kind of scientist would I be if I kept sticking to this, even in the face of evidence to the contrary? And I try to say to people, like, I don't have any skin in the game, other than hoping that the advice that we give is practical, usable, and evidence-based. And if it's not, then I hear you. Yeah, you can find people to be dogmatic and say, I don't know who that fool Phillips is. Like, you absolutely have to do this. And there's plenty of those people out there. It's all good.
Yeah, if you look hard enough, you can find them.
Oh yeah.
So what is next for Stu? What's next for you and your lab and your group? Like where do you see kind of the next couple of years with your research and just kind of the protein, I don't want to say industry, but like what's next for you guys?
Yeah. So probably sort of two or three fronts. First of all, we're focusing a lot on what protein supplements can do for older individuals, mainly because they're sort of the next frontier. From my perspective, I'm fond of pointing out that when we look at participation statistics, either from Canada or the United States, but just about everywhere around the world, that a very, very small percentage of people do resistance exercise per se at all. Even fewer of them do it according to the guidelines, which most people say twice a week. And that's by self-report. So I think that that's even an over-exaggeration. So I've been working pretty hard to try and push resistance exercise and strengthening exercises into not just physical activity guidelines, but then translation beyond that to try and get clinicians, physios, et cetera, to appreciate that it's not all just about cardiovascular and aerobic health, which of course is important, but we have, I don't know how many times, but let's say I'm thinking about 20 to 50 times more evidence in favor of that than we do of resistance training. But we're beginning now to peel back some of the layers on how good for you resistance exercise is. And it probably overlaps in the health benefits much more than we ever thought with aerobic exercise. And yes, there are some things that are unique to aerobic, probably resulting, from cardiovascular adaptations, but you also don't get strong doing aerobic exercise. So there's something unique to both domains. And as you get older, you're going to want to be fit and strong. It's not enough to just be fit. So let's just say that, at some point in your life, you're going to need strength to do something that's going to be critically important to your day-to-day activities. Point in the case, your grandmother is an example. And so try to emphasize, getting some of that into daily routines. It doesn't need to be complicated. It can be fairly simple, and sort of crack that nut. So we're working hard on that one. Women, we don't test enough women. We don't do enough studies in women. We know far less about women. There's a lot of thoughts out there around how the menstrual cycle or oral contraceptives or menopause affects women, et cetera, with respect to strength and muscle mass and everything. So that's another big area that we're focusing on. And I've got 2 Dynamite trainees who are working on that. And then the last part is acknowledging now with close to 8 billion people on this planet and soon to be 9.5 billion, the protein and the places we get it from has to change. I'm not a vegan, I'm not even a vegetarian, but animal-based proteins are not going to be able to provide enough protein for everybody in the world. And that's the macronutrient you need to survive. So, carbs, starch, pretty easy to get. Fats, pretty easy to get. So we're doing a lot of work on plant-based proteins to try and see whether this whole argument around digestibility, protein scores, that sort of thing, is really as big a deal as people make it out to be. Asked me 20 years ago, I'd have been, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a big deal. 15, I've been like, yeah, I'm pretty sure. 10 years ago, I'm like, fast forward to now, I'm like, I think it's a much smaller deal than people have made out to be. And I'll just say that I do think with some judicious planning and the proliferation of some plant-based proteins that are purified to the extent that all of the non-nutritional anti-digestive components, particularly dietary fiber, for example, are minimal, that you could be fine on a plant-based diet. But like everything, you have to be judicious about how you plan things. So those are the sort of 3 main areas. I dare say we'll bash away at maybe a few more, but those are the 3 big ones.
Well, I appreciate you touching on the animal versus plant plant-based protein? Because that was the last question that I was going to bring up.
Oh,
Just like
okay.
I had two
Okay.
kind of myth or facts, or just maybe things that have changed, and it was just that, it's like, is protein, whether it comes from an animal or a plant? And so it sounds like things might be changing,
Well,
or at least
like again,
perspectives or opinions. Maybe
yeah,
it
yeah.
might be a better way of saying
I
it.
think too is it's a change that's prompted by two things. First is science, and I have a good friend, good colleague, Luc Van Loon, who is
Oh
over
yeah.
in the Netherlands, and his lab's doing some really great work comparing plant-based versus animal-based proteins, and it seems that the differences, instead of being like this, are getting much smaller, to the point that they're maybe not as great a consequence. There are some populations that I'm concerned, the elderly, as an example, older people who are on exclusively vegan diets, but again, maybe if they're judicious about how they plan things, not that big a deal. So, again, science changes, but so has the food science around making these products as well. And there are an increasingly large, and it'll just get bigger and bigger, number of products now that are plant-based, that are a lot of Beyond Meat type products, as an
Right.
example.
Right.
And people say, oh, they're processed foods. And I'm like, oh, okay, fair enough. Like, so are hot dogs. That's formed a basis of a large portion of people's diet for a long time. So, but let's just say that you would be, when you eat those products, you're on close to equal footing as a piece of meat. It's not my choice, I'd say that, but there are plenty of other people who have no issues with that at all. And I think it's rhetoric to say, plant-based meat. I mean, that's just, it's poor practice to say this, that they're nutritionally poor sources of protein. They're not. So stay tuned.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think it's
What about because I'm interested in the animal quality. So like the studies that are looking at, is this just you go to a grocery store and you pick up just any steak that's on there, or you get something locally, grass-fed, free range, that sort of thing? And I would have to say it might be a dumb question, because the taste, it absolutely tastes different. How
yeah,
does a $2, I mean, it's not $2 now, but let's say there's a $5 to $8 steak at the local grocery store that just got mass production, and then I go to an actual farm and I get a steak, locally, and it tastes very different, but I paid $25 for it. I'm just, posing this
yeah,
hypothetical.
yeah.
How do those two steaks, even though they're very, very different in their own, nutritional value that those animals ate, how does that relate to, because I was taught in school that one's going to increase inflammation in my body and this one might reduce it. That's what I was. So I'm wondering, how does this translate to what you know?
Yeah. Well, so first I'll say this is, I mean, there's the economic argument over locally grown versus, feedlot fed in a state, or in our country, a province that's, thousands of miles away, that you could probably say, well, I'll take local, because the carbon footprint to get it to here is probably smaller. The big difference would be, feedlot fed, it's raised exclusively on grain. So that changes the lipid profile, the fat profile of the steak that you're going to get, versus the lipid profile of a piece of, an animal that's grass fed. And yeah, there may be something too, that the lipid profile of the grass fed beef is a little bit better. Taste wise, I'll also testify that yes, grass fed beef tastes different. It's sweeter. I think it tastes better. I don't know if that all justifies the price difference. I think then in the end, the question around, the health of eating this versus the other, that's getting down into sort of a much nittier, grittier, phase of things. I see people on Twitter and everything saying there's a massive difference, and it's not. I think it's a small difference. If you chose to do that over the course of your lifetime, then it may make a difference. But I don't think, if you're eating a steak every now and again, that the grass-fed versus the other one is going to make a huge difference. So but there are reasons why you might choose one versus the other, and I can appreciate that from a lot of different perspectives, if not, the least of which is the taste.
Right.
So
Right. Well, where my brain goes is if you're going to be studying animal versus plant-based and looking at how those gaps possibly have changed or closed or narrowed over the years, to me, the source of the animal protein would matter. It'd be like, okay, and
yeah,
then maybe that means you'd have to do a couple different studies to look at the food lot or the feed lot versus the
yeah,
local. So that means that's another study for you, to just look
yeah,
at.
yeah, 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 yeah.
That's just where
It's
my
a
brain
tough,
goes, is that the
yeah,
quality
it's a
that.
tougher one to do
Yeah.
because the only thing is so if you want to do controlled feeding trials and everything, we give everybody everything they're going to eat. The hack on the locally produced grass-fed and everything else like that is the money, right?
Yeah.
And so it becomes a little bit of it's a socioeconomic issue for certain people. So on, X number of dollars of, disposable food income, what is it you choose to spend things on? And I think that there are, I'll call it bigger hurdles to knock down on that. The knowledge that in the United States and Canada, all over North America, but almost globally, I don't know what the global statistics are, but in the United States and Canada, almost 50 cents of every disposable food income dollar is spent on a meal that is consumed within half an hour to 60 minutes of purchasing it. So that's either fast food or it's something that's, easy, like, microwavable prep type food. So
Where did you
my
hear that? Where's
what's
that?
that?
Where did you
Oh
hear that
yeah,
from?
I mean, you can get that data just about anywhere, but I mean, there's lots of different sources that you pull that together. And so then the choice is that most people are eating foods that are easy to prepare or are produced, from a fast food restaurant. And so they're ultra processed, they're hyper palatable, et cetera, et cetera. So then the question becomes, what do we target? And in my world, I'm targeting, let's try and reduce that first to get people to buy food that they cook and then that they sit down with their family. And so all of those are barriers because the number of people that sit down with their families on a given basis and have a meal is, it's sort of about 29% of families in any given week. So, there's lots of things that I would attack first before I would say, we need to do a study of feedlot fed versus grass fed versus vegan, et cetera, that sort of thing. So in broad strokes, I can understand the appeal of eating locally grown food and everything else like that. I think that there are bigger decisions to make around how you plan your diet than that one. And not to be trite about, I mean, I like grass-fed beef too, so I'll be honest about that. But I also have the luxury of choosing grass-fed beef. I live in a city. I point out to people that from the west end to the northeast end of the city, there's an almost 15-year difference in life expectancy, and that's completely driven by socioeconomics. And that's in Canada. It's not, but that's the difference between an average Canadian lifespan and somebody in sub-Saharan Africa. So, there's lots of other drivers of food choice that I think we could pay attention to, which would be translatable and have a big impact before I would tackle other things.
It's wild. It's wild.
Yeah.
I so appreciate your perception and just you're very cerebral in how you think through these things methodically, and that's why
I
I
don't
enjoy.
know if I'm cerebral or I'm just sort of telling you other things that people have told me, but that one,
Yeah.
has struck a chord. I mean, I've lived here now for 22 years. I go to a university here that's one of the pillars of our community, quote unquote.
Right.
And people say, what can we do for X, Y, or Z? And I'm thinking, we really need to help these people down here first. So on a limited food budget, what can we get them to choose? Because they're actually the people that spend an exorbitant amount of money on fast food and takeout
Yep.
and ultra processed. And
Yep.
it's just, I don't know whether it's education or what it is to try and get them to make some hopefully better food choices.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's a great place to stop. Any closing comments or any statements you'd like to make?
Well, I say this, we talked a lot about food. My go-to phrase is that exercise is the forgiver of a lot of sins. So even if you have a crummy, crappy, whatever it is, food choice scheme, your diet, is that a lot of the bad things that it brings on are forgiven with food. I mean, even, or excuse me, with activity. Even when you look at people who smoke, believe it or not, and that's just, I think it's one of the, obviously worst habits that you could adopt. If you're an exerciser and you smoke, and yes, I get it, there's not very many of them, your risk for everything goes down. And so if exercise can outpower smoking, then I think it's something that we all need to focus on. So the nutrition's good, don't get me wrong,
Right.
but I think it plays second fiddle to being physically active on a regular basis. So.
Well, we could have stopped the episode about 60 seconds ago and it would have been a fantastic one because it was everything was it was free flowing of information. It was great. And then you just confirmed my bias because I have a very movement activity exercise based and so yes, so thank you very much. Thanks for
My pleasure. It's good to preach to the choir every now and again.
That's right.
And have
That's
the
right.
same philosophy, but I honestly believe that. I mean, not that the two together, good nutrition and exercise, aren't
Right.
better. But if you're going to choose something, I'd prefer that it be activity and movement over something diet wise.
Brilliant. Stuart Phillips, everyone. Thank you so much for coming on. And we will certainly have you back on as your research continues to be just pumped out from McMaster. And so just again, well done. And thank you so much for coming on today.
My pleasure, Alex. Thanks for having me on the show.